Welcome everyone, Questini here with my faction tier list for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires patch 4.0. Now I'm going to do this in two parts. The first I'll talk about faction strength, and then I'll talk about which factions I think are actually the best to play overall. So, in terms of faction strength, let's start with the Beastmen, and we're going to start with Khazrak. I think Khazrak is C, really. Kind of middle of the road, not really too great, not really too bad either. He does have an incredibly difficult start, but he does have potential early on. He's just not really that special compared to the other Beastmen. Then we get Malagor and Mogr. I put the Beastmen as faction strength B tier, and I think Malagor and Mogr both fit in there. Their starting positions are relatively safe. They do have room to expand. They do have room to gain dread. They don't necessarily have significant issues to deal with because they start a war with minor factions that are easily taken out, and the other factions around them are busily fighting each other. So they are in a relatively safe starting position. Well, Malagor more so than Mogr, because Mogr may have to deal with the Fey Enchantress, though the Fey Enchantress does have her own issues. It's a bit complicated for Mogr because he doesn't want to expand too far in towards the Fey Enchantress, because he will encounter Orion and the Wood Elves, and they'll certainly declare war on him. But absolutely B tier for the Beastmen, for Malagor and Mogr. That leaves Tarax. I think Tarax is a solid A tier. I wouldn't go so far as to put him S tier in terms of his faction strength, because he still has those vulnerabilities early on as a Beastman, though he has an enormous amount of potential as a Beastman Legendary Lord compared to the others. Some would argue he deserves an S tier spot. If we're talking about late game strength, absolutely so, but if we're talking about like overall campaign strength, I think Tarax doesn't go higher than A. Absolutely significant amount of potential, dread, benefits, movement on the campaign map for his army, but all the same, I don't think he deserves higher than A, just because of the vulnerabilities he does have in the early game. Then we have Bretonnia. Lewin Leoncoeur. Lewin Leoncoeur is easily a C tier, maybe even a D tier as a faction. It's kind of a weird situation. On one hand, Lewin does have a good amount of combat power, but the problem in his campaign is, one, it's the hardest for him to gain vows out of all the Legendary Lords of Bretonnia, even the Fey Enchantress. Two, he has Be'lakor to the north, Norsca to the north, Greenskins to the south that he has to deal with, Marienburg as well that he may have to deal with, various Bretonian factions, Kemler, and then, of course, all the other factions that he may encounter. His west is secure because of the High Elves, but he is in a complicated situation. You don't want to expand north into Norsca, but at the same time, Be'lakor is almost certainly going to declare war on you, and so you're going to be in a position where you have to defend the north and while expanding the south. And you have to expand dealing with sieges, which, while Bretonnia is not the worst when it comes to siege tactics because they get the early game artillery, there are still issues that Bretonnia does have to deal with in that respect. And Lewin, like the problem with Lewin, while he has combat strength, he also has the worst starting position and the worst starting situation out of all the Legendary Lords of Bretonnia. The Fey Enchantress, she is in a better situation than Lewin, but I still think she's also in the C tier, because while she doesn't have Be'lakor, she has her own issues, and those issues include Mogr, Ikeclaw, that are going to be a problem, and also Grom. Now, she can defeat those threats, but absolutely a significant number of enemies that she will have to deal with early on that are going to limit her potential. And one interesting thing to mention about Bretonnia, while the Bretonian territory is good in the mid-late game, early on it's a giant nightmare to deal with because you have a lot of sieges again. Bretonnia is the kind of faction that does well in field battles, minor settlement battles, but not in sieges. And guess what? The Fey Enchantress also has to deal with. At least she starts with a good relation with Orion, but that's really about it. The only real benefit that she does have in her campaign. Having to deal with Grom, Ikeclaw, and Mogr from the very early start of your campaign is a brutal situation. Grom in particular can be a nightmare, though you can also wipe out his army relatively quickly if you hurry up with that. Then we get Rapunz. Rapunz is easy B tier. She has a much safer starting position. In fact, she has one of the best starting positions in the game. yes, she may have to deal with Archon, but her army is actually stronger than Archon. And while she does have a siege at the end of all of that, it's having one siege to deal with, really 2 sieges early on, like, because she does have a siege early on in her campaign. But here's the thing about Rapans. She does have easier access to artillery in quite a few ways. She does have relative safety in her starting position, and she has the room to expand, to get vows. Because of her desert situation, unlocking her vows is far easier than the others. Then we get Alberic. Funnily enough, I think Alberic, while his campaign is certainly slow because the jungle is going to slow him down, he's also in a relatively safe position. I mean, Marcus Wolfhard, he's going to get along with him. He's going to get along with Jan Bo. He's going to be able to expand relatively unimpeded. I mean, Gorok is certainly going to be an issue. The Lizardmen are going to be an issue. The Vampire Coast, absolutely not so much. Skrulk, kind of hit or miss. Depends on how well Skrulk does. But compared to the nightmares that Lewin and the Vayne Enchantress have to deal with, like, yeah, funnily enough, Alberic, who's kind of worthless in a lot of ways, and arguably the weakest Legendary Lord in terms of his benefits, Alberic does have a decent amount of campaign potential. The only downside I would say that really exists in Alberic's campaign now, it certainly put him lower than Rapans, but the only real downside that exists in Alberic's campaign is he needs to go to Sartosa, which is a really fun experience. Not really, but still. The campaign potential certainly does exist. Then we go into Cathay. I think when we're talking about Cathay, Miao Ying is an A tier, maybe even a B tier faction. Yeah, I'm going to go with B tier, really. Cathay is a good race in a lot of ways, minus the fact that they lack a melee hero and they lack a replenishment hero or replenishment option outside the Great Compass. But the problem is Miao Ying is certainly the kind of Legendary Lord, just she's not really that great or that special anymore. She's good to confederate, she's not really good to play. You have the situation as Miao Ying, where you've got Norscans coming in from the Great Bastion to the north that you have to deal with, and that means going to the Chaos Waste. And then you've got Snitch to the south you want to deal with. And you're going to be dealing with those things kind of simultaneously. Her faction effects are not necessarily that great. Her Lord effects, that's a different situation, but Lord effects, you can always get those by Confederation, which is certainly doable these days when you're talking about it. Another thing that is a downside, though, for Miao Ying is that she's the easiest to confederate out of the Cathay and Legendary Lords. She has the hardest time confederating other factions, specifically Yan Bo, Xiao Ming, like confederating the other Legendary Lords, because of what they'll generally achieve in their campaigns. Whereas the Miao Ying under AI control may achieve very little at all. Like playing campaigns as Yao Ming or Yan Bo is the easiest target to confederate out of the Legendary Lords of Cathay. So not recommended to play Miao Ying. I know they recommend her as a campaign. It's not necessarily a bad decision, but it's also not really a great one. Xiao Ming, absolutely S tier. While he's not on the same ridiculous level as Yan Bo, and his campaign ends up being a bit limited. I would argue, one, he has a safe starting position, he has a good amount of action potential. The only really limiting factor in this campaign, believe it or not, is you just kind of run out of territory to expand. Like, you take all of Cathay, you establish a pretty powerful empire with a good economy, and then it's like, then what, right? You go into the Darklands with unsuitable climate. That is the principal problem he has in his campaign, but if you're a new player, this is a campaign I would strongly recommend. It's a very easy campaign, it's a very... It's a pretty straightforward campaign in terms of what you do. It just, you kind of hit that limit. But in terms of an early game campaign or mid game campaign, it's absolutely a great campaign to play in a lot of ways. Then Yan Bo, who goes a lot of steps further. He has terrain to expand. He does have more faction potential. He does have that dual start. He is significantly stronger than Xiao Ming, but both of them are very strong Legendary Lords from my perspective. Both of them have powerful factions, good starting positions, good amount of potential. Xiao Ming may have a bit of a harder campaign if you go for the dual start, but he also has the tools necessary to succeed in that. So from my perspective, absolutely an S tier faction. Though, now that I think about it, really, when I'm thinking about S tier, I think that really the factions that should be put on S tier are the ones that are exceptional. Everyone else, like, if they're just good but not exceptional, yeah, let's go with A tier. Let's go with that. I think it would be unfair to some of the other factions that I want to put in S tier as well, to put Xiao Ming as well. Don't get me wrong, he does deserve it in a lot of ways, but there's factions that deserve it more. This brings me up to the Chaos Dwarves, and keep in mind, the races that these factions have may be S tier, because they're good races. The Legendary Lords and their campaigns don't necessarily deserve that. This brings me off to Astrogoth, A tier. You could argue very strongly that he deserves an S tier, but as I made the point, I think exceptional factions, only exceptional factions that really do a lot, or exceptional Legendary Lords, deserve an S tier. And I think Astrogoth, he's kind of the generic lord of the Chaos Dwarves. He has a relatively safe starting position. He is a neighbor of Grimgor, though you're not necessarily going to fight Grimgor right off the bat. In fact, you have the easiest time dealing with Grimgor because you just expand towards him, you deal with him potentially early before he really starts steamrolling, because Grimgor is most dangerous once he gets to a high enough level. Once he starts steamrolling, that's when he's at the most dangerous. Astrogoth can certainly deal with Grimgor before that. Don't get me wrong, Astrogoth is pretty cool in terms of his mech suit and all that, but I think his faction potential is actually the weakest of the Chaos Dwarves. Then we got Drazov, the Ashen. Drazov is the most powerful of the Legendary Lords of the Chaos Dwarves. Incredible faction potential, incredible income, powerful army, powerful magic, powerful melee. Like, Drazov is the best magic user in the game because he has both powerful magic and melee capability on himself, and he has a great skill line as well. It is rare to actually see someone like that. So yeah, Drazov is strongly recommended. He does have a complicated campaign situation early on, but you can certainly manage it. You will feel the full might of Grimgor, but hey, that is actually fun, and you can also deal with it. Keep in mind some of the vulnerabilities he does have, because Stretch, Emmerich, Orst, others, the Dwarves for instance, are going to be a nuisance that you're going to be dealing with in a campaign, but he does have all the tools needed to succeed in that. Then we get Zaytan the Black. Like, Zaytan in terms of like a late game potential would absolutely be like S tier, but in terms of early game potential, I would say he's B easily. Because while he's still a Chaos Dwarf and really powerful, he has the worst starting position of the Chaos Dwarves. He just has better faction effects in the long term than Astrogoth does when we're talking about it. And so, yeah, kind of middle ground A tier faction compared to others. I wouldn't say he's S tier. He is certainly S tier in the late game, but that's the difference. Drazov is S tier from the very start until the very end, whereas Zaytan, he needs to build up to it. He's the master of labor. He gets a lot of laborers. That means he can get a lot of money. He can get a huge industry. He can get a lot of influence. But at the same time, his starting position, like, he's got Grimgor in his backside, but he wants to advance north into Cathay. That kind of creates a complicated situation, suffice to say, when you're playing a Zaytan campaign. He is the master of artillery, if you will, but yeah. F tier, Daniel. I'm not even going to talk about that. If I need to explain why Daniel is an F tier faction, I'm not going to go into those details. He's just really bad. He's limited. He doesn't have a research tree. He doesn't have technology. His units are bad. His hero choices aren't great. His lord choices aren't great. What is there more to say about Daniel? Nothing. He's a horrible faction that has been ignored by Creative Assembly, basically. Like, actually, I'm tempted to just add another rank. You know what? I'm not even going to add Daniel to this list. Like, as far as I'm concerned, Daniel doesn't exist anymore, because I think it's insulting even to the F tier Legendary Lords to put Daniel on the same list as they are. So, F tier minus. F minus. Okay. Then, moving on. Marathi. Absolutely an S-tier faction. Great diplomatic potential, great economic potential, good starting position. She can make crazy alliances on the campaign map. She benefits from Sinnelleos corruption, so she has good control over her provinces. She has a great deal of potential in her campaign, and she starts with that potential. Like, you can conquer Ulfwan in like 40 turns, or, well, conquer Lawfern in like 30, 40 turns, eliminate Tyrion, basically put Alariel and Elfarion on the back foot, and then just annihilate them fairly easily in the campaign. The amount of things you can do in a Marathi campaigns are ridiculous. She gets a sorcerer benefit, so she'll have more magic users than anyone else. She will have a significant amount of heroes in her campaign, significant number of armies. Like, just how far you can get with Marathi is pretty goddamn ridiculous. Lokir Felhart, also an S-tier faction. He does start in a good position on the campaign map. He has an easy expansion path because he's basically surrounded by minor faction with only the Ikikla, really. Ikikla, Snitch, being close to him. And you can ally Snitch. So you can make a crazy alliance between yourself and Snitch, conquer all of Cathay if you so desire. You have the army to counter Cathay. You have a good amount of territorial capabilities as well in a campaign, and you get more Black Arcs than anyone else. And you also have the terrain in Cathay that suits Black Arcs in large part. So Lokir is in a very strong campaign position with the ability of achieving quite a lot. Morathi is better in the middle-late game than he is, far better. Lokir is easily the strongest, well, not the strongest, but the best legendary lord of the Dark Elves in terms of the early game, just because he can capture a lot of territory, he can get a lot of armies, he can get a lot of Black Arcs as well. It's tied together, and he ends up in a very strong campaign position. The only annoying thing about his campaign is chasing down a kite to wipe him out. That's it. Malekith, you know what? I think, like, I'm tempted to put Malekith as a B tier faction, but he is A tier. I just want to note that he does have issues in his campaign. His start is probably the worst start. Well, not true, right? It's the second worst start of the Dark Elves in a campaign. It's not really a great start to deal with. You can make it work by basically going to war with Grand very quickly. Like, you deal with this cave, and then you force march against Grand, then you take their territory, and then you start taking their castles, or their regions before Valkia steps in, and you can make some kind of deal with Valkia. Hell, you can even make a deal with Grombrindle if you so desire, though keep in mind that he's likely going to end up at war with Valkia. What you decide to do over there in the north, that's your decision, but he does work. It's just kind of a shitty start, really, that he has to deal with. And he is considered like the generic lord of the Dark Elves. Now, let me explain something about this. In Warhammer 2 in particular, and even Warhammer 1, the generic lord generally was, you could consider them the weakest in some ways, though considering Grimgor weak was always laughable. But they always had some limiting factor in, like, their skill lines in terms of faction effects, which still applies to Malekith. The thing about it, is the reason that worked is because the secondary lords, which had better faction effects, which had much more potential strength, they had more complicated starting situations, or in one way or another. Even if they start in the same position, they had a more complicated road ahead of them early on. Especially, but then we compare Warhammer 2, like you compare Morathi starting position to Malekith's starting position. Morathi's starting position was far harder than Malekith's starting position. That's, by the way, been reversed. So you end up in a situation where you have legendary lords that were designed based on that principle, and they just kind of fall behind now that in Warhammer 3, the starting positions are far more viable for everyone involved. So yeah, Malekith just kind of falls behind. Then we have Malus Darkblade. While he isn't my favorite to play, he certainly is an S tier faction. He can wipe out entire armies on his own. He has a ridiculous amount of growth in his campaign. He's just not my favorite Dark Elf faction to play. It's just like you spend a lot of time, traversing the castways, beating up everyone that stands in your way, picking a fight with Norsca. It does work, don't get me wrong on that. It certainly is a campaign that does work. The strength is there. I think anyone denying that Miles Darkblade is a strong legendary lord, yeah, he is. But at the same time, it's just not my favorite campaign. But absolutely, like, you get the choice early on, like, either you have a superhuman leading your army, or you get a ridiculous amount of growth and the potential of getting a doom stack from the very beginning of your campaign. Choices, choices, choices. Then we get Hellebrand. It's an interesting thing to think about Hellebrand. Like, I would say she's an S tier as well. Like, I know this might be feeling, this might sound like, oh, you're just, praising the Dark Elves, but when I consider the things that Hellebrand can do, well, she does work in a different way than Morathi. She kind of has some of the same benefits that Morathi has, because she has faction effects that really help her out in her campaign. Though in her case, she does have to sacrifice slaves. But it's not really an issue to have to sacrifice slaves. The army she spawns is kind of useless, but at the same time, yeah, Hellebrand has strong strength. She does have really good starting territory in her campaign. She has a relatively safe starting position in her campaign. She only gets to deal with greenskins. Yes, Valkia and Sigvald are coming, but you can beat them. Well, Hellebrand may be lacking somewhat in terms of the late game compared to the others. Like, we want to compare Hellebrand to Malekith? I'll tell you one thing. Like, let me make this comparison. Hellebron, when I'm playing a campaign against the Dark Elves, it isn't Malekith that I'm terrified with. In fact, Malekith is a speed bump. The person I'm terrified with is Hellebron. The amount of units, the amount of armies she puts together to smack you in the face is absurd. Just because she has easy access to territory, like 2 entire provinces that she has access to, she does have harder access to a Black Ark because she doesn't have a port very close by. She does have to work on getting that. But once she gets that, it is a ride, let's say. Well, again, she may not, she does lack the Black Ark, so she does lack some early game potential because of that lack of Black Ark, but all the same. Like, yeah, Hellebron's Strong Lord. I know a lot of people dismiss her, but the strength is there. Just not my favorite campaign, I admit. Not the favorite campaign for a lot of people. Then we have Rakarth. I think Rakarth is the worst legendary lord for the Dark Elves. He focuses on beasts, but his economy is limited. Weirdly enough, he's the only legendary lord of Dark Elves. In fact, I'm going to even go this far. I'm going to say Rakarth is C tier. He has a strong race, but he really screws himself over. It's going to take him a long time to take as much territory as the others. Like, the others will take entire provinces by the time Rakarth even has 1. And that's important because 1 means less battles, means less slaves, means less economic potential, means less units. So Rakarth's campaign is the slowest of the bunch. It's not hard, per se, I would argue, but it's just slow. And the Dark Elves, and it doesn't fit well in terms of, like, achieving the faction strength of the Dark Elves, because the Dark Elves are all about aggressive expansionism on the campaign map. That's how that works. But Rakarth just doesn't go with that. And the units they has the beast units that he has are just, they're good, but they're also too expensive to really utilize early on in the campaign. Then the meat of the campaign is always in the early game. Moving on to the Dwarves, Thorgrim. Thorgrim is certainly a D tier legendary lord. He's the generic legendary lord for Dwarves. He gets a growth benefit, he gets commandment benefit, he gets a grudge benefit. He has a relatively okay starting position. Beat up Skarsnip early on and you'll be pretty safe. Deal with Tretch if you want to. I mean, who doesn't want to beat up Tretch? And yeah, you're in a pretty good position. Removing Grimgor from the Battlelands certainly improved Thorgrim's situation by quite a bit. The only challenge, like, if you will, that Thorgrim is going to encounter is if you decide to try and save Barakvar, which you may want to try and save Barakvar early on from the hordes of Warzag and Greenskins, but if you do that, yeah, Thorgrim is in a pretty strong position. He does have a fair amount of campaign potential without the many downsides that the other Dwarven campaigns do have. Then we get Grombrindal. Grombrindal, it's an interesting one to think about. Like, I think Grombrindal is easily a B tier faction. Like, I would go even higher, actually. Like, in terms of the Dwarves are a D tier race, right? But Grombrindal does so much to benefit his race that it's absurd, like global recruitment, unit recruitment benefits, recruitment costs, recruitment ranks, casualty replenishment. He does a lot in terms of making the dwarves far stronger than they actually are, modded or unmodded. Like, if you're playing a dwarf campaign right now, I'd recommend the Dwarves Unforgotten mod. Obviously, this list is based on the vanilla experience. But Grombrindal, even in the vanilla experience, like, he does a significant amount to really improve the dwarves and make them far more playable. I just think that he's dragged down by the race, but he certainly does a lot to elevate the race. He has a pretty solid campaign plan, a relatively safe starting position, and he's just there to beat up Malekith. The difference between Grombrindal, like, you might wonder, why is Thorgrim so low? Why is Grombrindal so high compared to that? Well, faction potential, right? The casualty replenishment alone would elevate Grombrindal, but it's not just casualty replenishment, it's campaign movement range for every army in your campaign. It's recruitment costs, it's recruitment ranks. His Grombrindal's blue skill line is ridiculous. It's easily the strongest skill line in the entire game. Like, if I was to rank Grombrindal as a legendary lord alone, he would be S tier. That's how good he is. But he's dragged down by a crappy race, so make of that what you will. Ungrim, F tier. You have the Slayer King who doesn't want to use Slayers because you don't have enough benefits in his army to justify that. There are mods that do improve that, but yeah, Ungrim's grudge situation is annoying his army. He's basically a generic lord, like, completely generic. Like, yeah, even Thorgrim, he's supposed to be the generic lord, actually does does have some variety in his army, in his units, in his campaign. Ungrim has none of the benefits Thorgrim has, and he has every downside imaginable for a Dwarf Legendary Lord, and none of the upsides that some of the others do have. So yeah, absolutely an F tier. Making a Slayer Legendary Lord where the Slayer benefit is bugged, Journey's End, right? Well, it does work right now, or you can use a mod to fix it, the community bug fix. But here's the problem with Ungrim. It's like, Journey's End aside, the only army you would want to use Slayers would be his own army. And even then, they're not great. So you have basically a guy who you might as well just be a generic lord in your campaign and every other Dwarven campaign, because it would just better dwelling capability. Though less survivability, keep that in mind. Dungar may do more damage, but he's gonna die the fastest out of the Legendary Lords of the Dwarves, which isn't necessarily too big of an issue. Even he is fairly durable with enough items. But yeah, just Ungrim is not really a great campaign to play in a number of ways. Like, the faction effects are not there, the Lord effects are not there, the Special Lord skill line just isn't there, so yeah, absolutely F tier. Then we get Belegar. Belegar is the D tier Legendary Lord for the Dwarves. I'd say he's worse than Ungrim. He has a very strong army, but it's just one army until you take Arcade Peaks. You have a complicated situation with Aranessa, Ekklaw, the Wood Elves, you name it, and it's a mess of a campaign. And honestly, I would recommend not playing Belegar. It's not that he's horrible. He does start with all those heroes, and his army is probably one of the stronger armies early on in a campaign because of those heroes, and Belegar himself being a fairly durable lord. But the thing about Belegar is I would not recommend playing him. I would recommend confederating him. So yeah, he's absolutely not worth playing. Faction strength-wise, he has that army, but he has severe economic issues early on in campaign. He has a significant number of problems. If you take Arcade Peaks and a good amount of territory around it, then yeah, you become ridiculously strong. But until that point, it's not a great situation. I don't think it's a campaign worth playing. And I think the strength is limited by the early economic issues that you will encounter for much of the campaign. Also, one thing to mention, if you're playing Belegar, you're likely going to have to rescue Thorgrim. Whereas Thorgrim, if you're playing him, you're rescuing yourself. So, like, Belegar is not worth playing because his campaign, like, he's the most durable, like, or the most survivable out of all the Legendary Lords in a campaign. Him and Ungrim, like, yeah, funnily enough, you don't want to play him. But that's a further reason to not play him, because you can play campaign for Ungrim and Confederate. Like, if you want to play campaign in the area that Belegar wants to go for, yeah, playing Thorgrim is a much better choice. He's a better lord to play. He doesn't have those economic issues. He doesn't have the crazy army Belegar has, but, yeah, Thorgrim has more achievable strength early on in a campaign than Belegar does have. But both are kind of in a similar level, just in terms of who's worth playing. Yeah, I would say Thorgrim is worth playing more. Then we get Thorik Ironbrow. It's a mess. Like, faction strength-wise, you can get a really powerful army, but it's just one army. You are in a limited campaign situation. The grudges are going to screw you over. The objectives of the campaign basically are going to screw you over. You've got a lot of hostile factions next to you, and you basically want to expand along a strip of territory, so that means you're going to be very vulnerable on all sides from all factions that might decide to take a bite out of your territory. So yeah, Thorik has power in his campaign, that's undeniably so, but that power is again caged, similar to how it is for Belegar. It's kind of an interesting decision on Creative Assembly's decision. Like, they give us lords that, if they weren't so limited because of other reasons, they would actually be quite strong, but that's the thing, they did limit those lords. Moving on to the Empire, Karl Franz, absolutely an F tier faction. Like, not worth playing. One of the worst campaign starts in the game, one of the worst situations, some of the worst faction mechanics to play, limited terrain, spending, like, basically, if you're playing Karl Franz campaign, you'll be dealing with the annoyance of the Electricons for the vast majority of the campaign, trying to keep them alive, trying to maintain Imperial authority. It's not a great system, and your faction strength is limited because you actually won't be taking a lot of territory. Like, you want to talk about faction strength. Faction strength is determined by how much territory you have, because the more territory you have, the more unit types you can increase, the more hero capacity you can increase. The more your economy will grow, the stronger you'll become. Karl Franz is incredibly slow in terms of getting territory because of the limitations of Imperial authority. But you still need to care about the Empire, because if you don't, you are going to get screwed over by the Imperial Authority situation. So yeah, not a great campaign dynamic to be dealing with as Karl Franz. It was better in Warhammer 1, far better in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2. Like, Karl Franz is supposed to be friendly for new players, but given how things currently stand in his campaign, I would say that he's absolutely not worth playing for anyone at all. Gelt is in a similar situation. Gelt has an easier starting position. He doesn't have to waste time dealing with a rebellion like Karl Franz does have to do. He can colonize the mountains, so he does have more faction potential, but he's still hamstrung by the same issues. And even worse, he's closer to Vlad, and Vlad is a fucking nightmare to deal with in a campaign. Volkmar, I'd say, is a C tier. While the Empire is still not a great race, Volkmar at least has a lot of potential. He's not hamstrung by Imperial Authority. He can get the books of Nagash for a significant number of strength. The thing that's going to limit Volkmar's potential is that, yeah, he's going to have to fight Manfred and then Tic-Tac-Toe and others in the early game. But if you do manage to do that, you can gain a decent amount of strength if you are playing as Volkmar. It's just issues. Again, like, the Empire has issues. It does need them. And similar to Volkmar, you have the Hunts Marshal. He's limited by the hostility meter, by hostility, but he does get really strong units very early on in the campaign. Like, you can get great swords, you can get artillery, you can get a significant number of different unit types fairly early on in the campaign because of the Imperial supply system. So that does end up working in your favor if you're playing the Hunts Marshal, but you do have a lot of control issues, territorial issues. It's a bit bizarre that they can take certain territorial types, but it does. At least you do have the faction strength because of the units you will be getting from Imperial supplies. Like, you want to talk about Hellstorm rocket batteries early on in the campaign? Yeah, you can get those, and cannons as well. So siege situation is in complete misery, which is the case for all the other campaigns.